started. This is our very minimalist setup right here.
Very precarious.
Welcome to those of you joining on YouTube as well. I'm so glad that you are here with us. If you'd like to join us for the 60-minute introduction to Žižek, Lacan, Hegel, Kant, Marx, etc. class, you have come to the right place. Every single Monday for the past 2 years, I've been teaching an introduction to philosophy and psychoanalysis class, open access, live here on Instagram. And today we're going to be tackling the question of the Master Signifier. What is the Master Signifier and how does it relate to things such as exams or sports, etc.? But first of all, I just want to briefly introduce Jenny.
Hi there. I see some of you are already letting us know where you're joining us from. I see Ethiopia. That's very cool. Julie and I are in London, as you mentioned. I think this is actually our last week, maybe, that we're here in London. So thank you very much for joining us, and apologies for being a little bit late. Now that we're doing the classes in the afternoon, we're still learning how to budget our time, but I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry that we're a little bit late today. We usually try to start at 8 a.m. USA PT, but obviously we're in a different part of the world. If you're joining us, I just want to very briefly say that you can download an ebook version of these classes called 5 Keys to Žižek, Where Nothing is Lacking. It's a beginner's introduction to some of the philosophical theories that Žižek uses, and you can find that exclusively on our Patreon. It's called 5 Keys to Žižek. Each chapter deals with one of Žižek's key philosophical ideas, like what is the sublime object of ideology and who is tickling the tickler subject. If you'd like to read along with these classes, if you'd like to download the ebook, you can find that exclusively on Patreon. And a very big thank you to our patrons who also keep these classes open access and free for everybody else around the world, because that's really the best part of doing this project, is that we don't have to paywall classes. We can actually keep them free for everybody to join. So huge thank you to our readers. And if you'd like to read the book 5 Keys to Žižek, you can find that exclusively on Patreon. Any other housekeeping?
Well, I think we're also going to be doing some more Q&A. I don't know if you're ready to announce that yet. We're going to be launching a Substack with some Q&A. So we keep getting people signing up for Substack. And so if you're signed up, keep an eye out for that. There should be more information coming. So hope you can join our Discord, submit some questions, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
That's right. We're going to be posting the link to the Substack very soon. And Jenlene has kindly offered to edit the Substack for us so that you can hopefully get snippets. Okay, let's jump right in. We're going to be here for about 60 minutes, so make yourself comfortable. And I'm going to try to make these ideas accessible along the way. I know on YouTube the camera's a little bit muddled today, so apologies to people watching on YouTube. But I'm gonna start. All right. So we're going to be talking about the Master Signifier, one of Lacan's key ideas, which Žižek uses in many different and interesting ways. But I want to start in a very easy fashion. I want to start by saying, I want to talk about something that everybody can probably relate to, and that is the specific torture, and yet also somewhat pleasurable practice of studying for exams. I think everybody who's watching here has at one point in their life studied for an exam, for better or for worse. And there's something that I want to talk about when it comes to exams that will hopefully help you understand what Žižek means when he refers to the Lacanian idea of the Master Signifier. Now, if you've studied for an exam and you've participated in an exam, you know that there's always that brief, sometimes long, but usually brief moment between you taking the exam and receiving your grade. There's always that disconnect between the process of actually participating in the exam and then realizing what your outcome was. And for most people, this is kind of a tense moment, right? You have a certain understanding of how you thought you performed in the test, and yet you need to have that result be in some manner formalized. And when I was a student, I remember that often it was the tests or the papers that I'd written that I thought were best that ended up turning out to be not very good. And the ones that I struggled with that I thought I might have flunked, in a weird way, turned out to be some of the papers or some of the tests that I did best on. And so that moment of anxiety, that disconnect between participating in an exam and receiving your results, that's what I want to talk about here. Because Lacan actually writes about this psychological process that you undergo when you take an exam. And What Lacan says is that when you partake in an exam, that is the constitutive part. Whereas receiving the grade, receiving the mark for Lacan, is the performative part. Now, when you think about that, that seems a little bit counterintuitive. Why would taking the exam be constitutive? After all, usually we think about it being the other way around. You would think to yourself that the performative aspect is participating in the exam, and that the constitutive element would be the formalization of your grade. So why does Lacan say that participation in the exam is constitutive and receiving the grade is performative? Well, for Lacan, it's because the grade essentially doesn't matter, right? Some of your teachers will tell you this. They'll say, well, your grade doesn't really matter. And of course, it's the student who knows that the opposite is true. Of course, your grades matter. In many ways, your grades matter more than whether or not you're actually a smart person. And it's totally unfair because you realize that the way in which you are graded doesn't actually relate to how well prepared you are, how intelligent you are, how hardworking you are. Instead, the grade tells a story about you that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality. It's almost like this magical reflection of how you performed in one key moment. And that's why for Lacan, the mark, the grade, is performative, because by means of you accepting the grade, you're accepting the institution and the symbolic practice of participating in the exam and why it's important. And so of course it's the teacher who would say grades don't matter, because it's only the teacher who can properly embrace the performative aspect of the grade. When I used to be a professor, I realized, and this was a horrific realization I had, is that when professors are grading papers, it's not a perfect science. Sometimes, depending on your mood or depending on an idea the student expresses, whether it's well articulated or not, you'll be more inclined to give the student a better grade or a worse grade. Now, of course, you could say that when it comes to a multiple choice exam, that isn't true, and yet it works in the opposite way. When you're taking a multiple choice exam, it's you who are questioning yourself. This is actually a really interesting statistic, is that when you're participating in a multiple choice exam, most of the time, your first instinct is correct, which is interesting considering that a multiple choice exam shouldn't be something that you make on instinct. It should be something that you rationally consider. And yet most mistakes in a multiple choice exam occur when you start doubting your own original instinct. And so here we have a mirror image between the professor who's marking an essay, and depending on his own thoughts about the quality of the essay, may be more inclined to give you a favorable grade, depending on the beginning or the end, whereas the student might be more inclined to start self-sabotaging, depending on how much they doubt themselves. And so again, we have this idea that the grade is the performative part, whereas the participation in the exam is the constitutive part. For Lacan, this is another way of saying that we all believe the grade means something, because in a sense it has to mean something. Because if the grade didn't mean something, then why are you going through all this effort of preparing yourself to take the exam? Now, there's a couple of things that I want to talk about here in a little bit more detail. First of all, when you're participating in an exam, you find yourself in what is essentially a hysterical position apropos the symbolic. And when I used to be a teacher, I saw this with students all the time. They'd come to me and they'd say, what do I need to know to do well in this exam? Or I would be giving a lecture, and a student would ask me the completely reasonable question, which is this something I will be tested on? And so what you're essentially asking is, what is the element of knowledge, of the information that is being transferred, that I need to retain in order to participate successfully in the exam? When the truth, the Lacanian real of the situation, is that there is no recipe for success. I'm not saying you have to memorize the following things in order to get a good grade. Instead, what you're relying upon is that the student can apply what we used to call critical thinking and use that in an essay or an article, etc. And so we would have these entire Q&A sessions dedicated to what does the professor mean by critical thinking? And of course, the professor would say, I can't tell you what I mean by critical thinking. You have to come up with the answer. Now, this is cruel. This is the minimally sublime cruelty that exists within the educational system, by which you're telling the student that they have to conform to a certain set of requirements, and that those requirements can only be deducted or deduced by the student themselves, and depending on how well they deduce them, they will receive a pretty good grade or not. Now, this minimally sublime element isn't just true for education. It is also true for bureaucracy. And this is Žižek's argument about bureaucracy. Žižek says that bureaucracy hinges on the gap between the measurement and the formalization of the outcome, between the quantitative and the performative. What makes bureaucracy, in a very Kafkaesque way, terrifying is that it never feels like the objective situation is being measured. It feels like you are being measured. And bureaucracy has to hold on to this minimal gap between the quantitative and the performative. In other words, if you knew exactly how the bureaucrat would respond to your paperwork, it would no longer be bureaucracy. The power of the bureaucrat resides precisely on his interpretation of your petition on behalf of the institution and the state and the forces that underlie it. And so bureaucracy isn't the immediate exchange between paperwork and rubber stamping. Bureaucracy is the tension that exists between you wondering whether you have submitted the correct paperwork and them getting to choose or decide whether it is indeed the minimal required paperwork. Jenilene and I both used to live in the United Kingdom, and one of the things that was unique about the United Kingdom to us was that when it came to dealing with the Home Office, which is what you have to do if you're a foreigner when it comes to visa requirements, etc., is that the Home Office would give you a phone number to call, and every time you called that phone number, there'd be nobody there. And this is the perfect phone number for the Kafkaesque bureaucracy, which is that you call a number asking what you need to do, and you will never receive an answer, because the whole point is precisely to maintain the performative relationship to your quantitative utterance, which is, what do I need to do in order to prove to you that I am a person? And that's the bind that you find yourself in. Now, of course, this sublime relationship, and I mean it's sublime in a quite literal sense, because what is happening is that we have an impossibility of relation. What we have is, sorry, we lost the internet. What we have is an impossibility of relationship. There can never be a proper, let's say, coming together, a Tetris block situation or two Lego blocks connecting between the quantitative and the performative. It wouldn't be bureaucracy without the minimal gap between your petition and your insecurity about whether or not you would be approved. In the same way that an exam would no longer be an exam without the tension between, I don't know how well I did, and receiving the grade that will retroactively formalize whether or not I did indeed perform well in the exam. And so that's what makes this a sublime element, and that the sublime only exists precisely in the contours left behind by the failure of the relationship to begin with. But what I want to point out is that the sublime gap, which Lacan would call the real here between the imaginary and the symbolic, your imaginary take on your own performance, whether it's in the exam or in the bureaucracy, and the symbolic order that upholds the reason that you participate in the bureaucracy and the exam in the first place, namely the grade or receiving the visa. This can also have a joyful aspect. Now, of course, I'm not saying that you should enjoy exams or you should enjoy bureaucracy, but think about it for a moment. If you're a doctoral student, a graduate student, a PhD student, one of the things that makes a PhD so difficult is precisely, at least in most systems, the absence of exams, the absence of something to study or prepare for. In some cases, the absence of your supervisor you have to chase down. And so what is worse than being stuck within the sublime gap between the quantitative and the performative, between the imaginary and the symbolic, is when you fall into the real, which is now it is only up to you to invoke the existence of the other, the knowledge of the other, your supervisor, or there is no test, so now I have to come up with what it means to work independently outside the realm of testing. But we can find something more enjoyable than that, of course. And an enjoyable version of this gap, you can find it in sports. Jenilene and I both enjoy watching sports quite a bit. And what happens within a game, whether it's soccer or basketball or really any competition, could be the Olympics, is that when you go in to the performance, when you watch the game, you don't know the outcome. And of course, we wouldn't watch sports if the outcome was simply a rational outcome on predetermined statistics or measurements. In other words, it's not just that the strongest athlete, the best prepared athlete, the most physically capable athlete wins. Instead, what makes sport beautifully sublime is, again, this anxiety and this tension of not knowing how those preconditions will be interpreted in the moment. Will a star be able to perform and score all the points? Will there be a sudden unexpected injury? Will there be some kind of turnaround in the game by which it's precisely the unexpected loss of what appeared to be the strongest team that provides the enjoyment? And so here we find the kind of enjoyment that we experience by the non-knowledge of the other, as it were. The fact that you go into a sports game not knowing who will win is what makes it enjoyable. If a sports game were, in a sense, always going to be a situation in which the title goes to the better team, you wouldn't watch. What makes it enjoyable is the option, the choice, not the choice, the possibility that something unexpected will occur. And so within the confines of a game, whether it's 60 minutes or 90 minutes or 45 minutes, you're enjoying that kind of free-form possibility in which anything could happen. And then once it has happened, you'll see all the sports commentators retroactively creating a narrative to fit what happened back into the overall narrative of the season, whether a team is doing well or doing poorly, whether the coaching is considered good or bad. Often it doesn't even depend on whether or not the coach is very good. It depends on what the outcome of the game is. A call that a coach makes can be considered genius if it leads to a win, and considered an utter catastrophe if it doesn't yield those results. And of course, what it means to be a successful athlete or a successful coach is precisely that you're willing to take on the risk of making those essentially gut instinct decisions when the pressure is at its highest. The definition of a star athlete isn't the person who is the most equipped or the best player. It's the person who can rise to the occasion repeatedly. And of course, rising to the occasion repeatedly, having a kind of persistence when it comes to being able to compete successfully, isn't something that you can premeditate. It's not something that you can simply game out by training more or working harder. It's something that emerges only within the as of yet unstructured possibility of the game itself. A star is made when somebody scores in the final moments of the game, not if they score at the beginning of the game. And so as a fan, as a participant, we enjoy that gap between the consultative and the performative. It's also why it's so important that there's a trophy at the end of any season. The trophy, if you've ever supported a team that actually ends up winning in the end, it's an oddly anticlimactic moment. Everything hinges on getting to the moment in which your team hoists the trophy, and yet, in a sense, by hoisting the trophy, the game is over. That is the ultimate thing you can have, and yet it doesn't really matter. It's just an object. And of course, the whole thing has to start over again. This is also why people support sports teams that are very objectively bad sports teams, because enjoying sports isn't just enjoying the pleasure and the highs of victory, but in a sense, it's also enjoying the pain and the struggle and going through the process of having a little bit of both. Okay, so that's an instance in which we have an enjoyable relationship between the consultative and the performative. And what's important here is we're talking about the Master Signifier. And you could say that something similar happens with, well, let me take it a step back, actually. I don't want to go too far here. Let's talk a bit about the trophy. Because the trophy is a little bit like the grade that you get. You want to have a good grade in your exam. And so you partake in the exam. You try to do whatever you can in order to be suitable for getting a good grade. Then it comes down to the moment, how the questions are articulated, whether you can rise to the challenge, whether you can receive the top mark. The same is true for sports. An athlete is competing against other athletes, but it all comes down to a small moment of indecision in which they can rise to the occasion or not. Often there is a dose of unpredictability here. There's a certain amount of luck. The same is true for an exam. Do you get a question that you know how to answer? And yet, whether it's the mark or the trophy, both of those by themselves are essentially symbolic. The trophy is just a trophy. The mark is just a number. And yet, in a sense, they're super important precisely because they're only symbolic, because they have no real worth or value outside the competition or the exchange. The trophy is the thing at the top that symbolizes that you have outperformed everybody else, and yet you wouldn't even try to outperform everybody else if it weren't for the trophy. The same is true with the mark or the grade. Your grade symbolizes your successful pursuit of educational valor so that then you can hopefully compete in the job market, etc. And yet you wouldn't be competing in the first place without the possibility of having a grade. And a grade, of course, is a reflection upon everybody else's grade. This is also why traditionally in like some of the old-fashioned schools, all the grades would be posted at the same time to one board so that you would be looking at everybody else's grade as well, not just your own. And so the grade becomes, in a sense, the facilitator of an entire social hierarchy. Now, your identity becomes predicated on how well you did in the exam rather than the other way around. Some people are top students, other people struggle, other people make it part of their identity that they don't try hard in exams. And so within the universe that is the school, the grade becomes a reflection of the social hierarchy itself. And that's exactly why the grade, as the professor says, means nothing. And yet it means everything. And that is the Master Signifier for Lacan, for Žižek. The Master Signifier is the ultimately arbitrary marker of an entire social constellation and hierarchy and interaction that by itself means nothing and yet imbues everything else with meaning and thereby appears as that which means everything. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of how this works outside the school and outside an athlete's arena, a sports arena. Traditionally, within the pre-modern world, the idea was that the Master Signifier had to come from the monarch, that the king was the representative of God on earth, and that within the umbrella of the king as a trophy or the king as a grade, the king could give honors to citizens that would uphold the social structure as such. In the United Kingdom, we still see this. You can receive a knighthood or an OBU, and this signifies your social standing amongst your peers. Now, one of the things that we're seeing in the United States right now is that traditionally, this master signifying function, of course, wasn't a monarch, but it was supposed to be something like the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was supposed to be the ultimately arbitrary yet entirely important guarantor of social participation and meaning. And that if you had a dispute within society, the Supreme Court, as a seemingly non-political organization, could, in a sense, ratify the parameters under which social participation occurred. Now, I want to you'll understand where I'm going here, as we're talking about Roe v. Wade in the United States right now. And what's so fascinating to me about the whole polemic around Roe v. Wade and trying to ban abortion in the United States is that the memo that was released, so the memo that the judge was writing to justify the imminent getting rid of Roe v. Wade. What's the legal term? Not getting rid of.
I don't know, eradicating? Yeah.
Not eradicating.
There must be a technical
reversal.
term.
Now, the argument is so interesting here from the judge. The argument from the judge was that Roe v. Wade had been wrong to begin with. Why? Because it politicized the court. In other words, that by getting rid of Roe v. Wade, the court would be retroactively non-political, that it would cleanse itself of politics by means of what is, objectively speaking, the most political decision the court has made within the last 50 years. Now, this is essentially the idea of the Hegelian unity of opposites, that things never happen under their own guise, they happen seemingly under their opposite guise. For example, most wars are fought under the auspices of preserving the peace. All you have to do is look towards the way in which Russia currently frames the war in Ukraine, not as a war, but as a politional action, as safeguarding the peace. This means that, as in Brecht's Mother Courage, when the main character says, "Don't tell me that peace has broken out," that peace becomes paradoxically the banner under which war is waged, and not just by Russia. This is something that we've seen over the course of generations, that the invective of peace is usually the determinant of war. And what's so interesting here, in the same way that the court now argues that the reason Roe v. Wade should be overturned is because it will make the court non-political, most political actions today are taking place precisely under the auspices of wanting less politics in the public sphere. Think about the way in which traditionally we thought about supposedly non-political spaces such as sports stadiums as being free from politics. Those have become the very places in which politics is staged, what Lacan and Freud would have called a return of the repressed. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that there's always a minimal gap between, like I said, the constitutive and the performative, between the imaginary and the symbolic, between participating in an exam and receiving the grade, between going through customs and waiting for the customs agent to let you into the country, between watching a sports game unfold and seeing who is in fact the champion, between voting for a party and seeing the future of the nation unfold in an election that appears to be uncertain. And on the one hand, this is the abyss. This is a terrifying position to be in, a position of uncertainty, in which something which is as of yet open will retroactively determine who you think you are, for example, when you participate in an exam. And at the same time, there's something revolutionary and beautiful in the sublime gap. Think about an election. An election is precisely never the participation in a purely rational accumulation of who is the most technocratically capable leader. When we participate in an election, we all stand back in a radical moment of faithful participation that a kind of other will decide for us, that other being the collective vote of quote unquote the people. And this is exactly how all power works, whether it's a monarch who says that I'm the representative of God on earth and that now I can guarantee the sanctity of those who are in power, or whether it's the Master Signifier of democracy, capital D, where we all, or at least most of us, vote and then step back to see what the collective vote tally will say about the future of the nation. And so going into an election feels similar to going into a sports finale. In a sense, we already know from polling, from statistics, who is the most likely candidate to succeed and who will perhaps be the ruling party. And yet it's within that moment of indeterminacy between the vote being cast and the outcome being ratified that anything could happen, that we exist in a moment of pure, in a sense, purely speculative realism in which the future has not yet been decoded. We have not yet told a story to ourselves about what has just happened. And this is both an exciting state to be in, it's both pleasurable, and yet at the same time, it's a little bit terrifying. Think about the election in 2016, in which everybody had told themselves that Brexit wouldn't happen and that Trump wouldn't happen. And then for the next 4 years, or up until now, we've retroactively been trying to explain why Trump was inevitable and why Brexit was inevitable. And here we get to another Lacanian concept, which is what Lacan calls the answer of the real. When we see the gap between the imaginary and the symbolic, we have to, in a certain sense, embrace knowledge on the emptiness of faith. Let me give you an example of this from a popular cartoon series you may know called The Simpsons. One of my favorite scenes in The Simpsons, I think it was a meme as well, is Homer Simpson, who is usually presented as like the Freudian id, like the pure embodiment of the id. But Homer Simpson is a much more intricate character than that. There's a scene in which Homer Simpson wants to eat a donut. And so Homer Simpson has a donut in his hand, and he looks up at the sky, and he says, God, if you don't want me to eat this donut, send me a message now. He waits. There's no answer from God. There's no thunderbolt of lightning in the sky. And Homer says, thank you, God, and he eats the donut. Now, what's beautiful here is that Homer isn't saying there is no God, so I can eat the donuts. Instead, Homer is saying, God, send me a message that you don't want me to eat the donuts, and I will leave it be. And so now, Homer's eating of the donut retroactively has been sanctified by God. We have a holy donut that Homer is eating, not because he wants to eat it, but because God has willed it.
Act of worship.
An act of worship. After all, he is simply following God's orders, or a lack of orders, in eating the donuts. And I've talked about this before, but this is how Žižek relates Lacan to Dostoevsky. For Lacan, it's precisely because God exists that we have radical freedom. In the same way that it's for Homer that the invocation of God is why he's allowed to eat the donut. And here is kind of interesting, because here there's a little bit of a joke here that I read recently that I think applies as well. And it was about the pianist Liszt. And Liszt was a Catholic. And another pianist who wasn't Catholic said that Liszt was typical of all Catholics, because Protestants fear the devil and love God, whereas Catholics love the devil and fear God. And this is a key distinction. For the Catholic, like Homer, they fear God so that they can love the devil. Homer fears the God, the vengeful God who can come down and smite him with his donut, precisely so that he can enjoy the donut. In other words, Homer is enacting here the Catholic ritual of faith v. knowledge by saying, I fear God so much that I can love the devil. And that's precisely the Catholic ethic here that someone like Liszt, a famous bohemian and romantic and womanizer, would be for this Protestant. And of course, for the Protestant ethic, it's exactly the other way around. You fear the devil, but you love God. And now you have to punish yourself. Now it's up to you. Now you have to embrace a work ethic of good deeds by which you are proving and performing for God, who you love, that you are indeed worthy of his love. And so now you're not allowed to eat the donut. The Protestant can't eat the donut, but the Catholic can, because the Catholic loves the devil and fears God. And so it's precisely this fear of God that releases you, that makes you completely free. In the same way that Lacan had his play on Dostoevsky when he said, it's precisely because God exists that I can be free. Again, to go back to the Hegelian idea of the unity of opposites, we don't have freedom coming as the result of the escape from restraint, right? Vengeful, cruel God who we fear, and if we get rid of the fearful God, we will be free. No, it's precisely within the logic of the God that we fear that we can properly embrace the freedom of the devil. And that's perfectly staged within The Simpsons. Now, is this so far so good? Okay, because there's a couple of things that I know we're going a little bit fast here. Okay, so Jolene and I recently went to see an opera. We've seen a couple of operas, but there's a very interesting opera here that I want to juxtapose with something else that we've seen. So we saw a play, which is called The Age of Rage. And we saw an opera, which is Wagner's Lohengrin. Lohengrin is the opera that the German author Thomas Mann referred to as being the height of German Romanticism, especially the two overtures. Now, what's very interesting is that the traditional divide in our, not traditional, but the contemporary divide that we have within our society today is the seeming quote-unquote choice between, on the one hand, populism, and on the other hand, liberalism. The idea that we have an enlightened, civic, liberal populace versus the irrational passions of, quote-unquote, the mob populism. And one of the sad things is that many performances of theater and opera, etc., that I've seen in recent years have tried to present and flatter the audience with this kind of a binary, saying, you, theater goers, are part of the civilized liberal elite, and this play or this opera is, in a sense, a moral story about the danger of succumbing to public passion and populism and the mob, as it were.
And it seeks to reassure the audience that their biases against populism are justified.
Exactly. That they, by means of attending this play or this opera, are not part of the mob, as such. Now, what's interesting about both Age of Rage and Lohengrin, but let's stick with Lohengrin for a moment first, is that the version of Lohengrin that Jolene and I saw was essentially staged as being this contemporary choice, the choice between enlightened liberalism and irrational popular energy, as it were. And let me give you a very brief description of Lohengrin, of the plot synopsis. Essentially, it is a sequel to Wagner's Parsifal. You could also argue that it is the second part in what will then lead to Wagner's Ring Cycle, and I'll explain in a moment why. You don't agree with that, though, right?
That's okay.
You don't, do you want to make a counterpoint to that?
No.
Okay. Now, what happens within Lohengrin is that we have we're essentially in Brabant, around 900. I think around 900. And we have a woman who is accused of having murdered a relative to take power. Mm-hmm. And essentially, the jury or the justice, the decision as to her fate will be reached in combat. And so the accuser says, if someone will step up for this woman, I will face them in combat, and God will come down to earth, and whoever wins the combat is the person who is correct. So here we have a really interesting idea of justice, right? Instead of saying we're going to weigh all the evidence 2 and 4 and listen to the victim and listen to the accuser, instead we have here someone has been accused, a woman has been accused of a heinous crime, of a murder, and we will have 2 people fighting, the accuser and a champion of the accused, and whoever wins will have been chosen by God, thereby retroactively determining the right of the victor. And so if the accuser wins, then the accuser becomes the rightful victor chosen by God. And vice versa, if the champion of the woman wins, then the woman is redeemed in the eyes of God. Here we have a direct correlationship between the idea of the deity and the sort of helpless puppets on earth that are enacting divine will or divine justice. Now, the accuser who has accused the woman of murder says, will someone step up and defend this woman? And twice, there is only silence. We have here a kind of answer from the real, like Homer lifting up his donut and saying, God, if you cannot prevent me from eating this donut, then eating the donut is a sign of your divine will that I eat it. And here we have no one comes to rescue the woman. And so we think as a member of the audience, God is tacitly implying that the woman is indeed guilty. At least that is how the accuser interprets it. And then lo and behold, in traditional Wagnerian epic fashion, we have a huge brass section that comes in and a champion emerges, an Arthurian knight who is carried by a giant swan, a ship that looks like a swan, completely decked out in white. The champion of the woman, the emissary of God, arrives to fight on her behalf. And it's not even a fight, right? In this case, we have the accuser wielding a sword and the champion of God simply raising his hand and the sword falls to the ground. We have divine will represented on behalf of the woman. She is redeemed. And yet, what's so interesting about the way in which Lohengrin was staged in the version that Jenlene and I saw at the Royal Opera House here in London is that what subsequently happens is that the chorus that sings Hail Lohengrin, that supports Lohengrin, the chorus is presented as a 1930s fascist mob. In other words, the version, which I think is totally misguided for this staging of Lohengrin, suggested that the champion, Lohengrin, who comes riding in on a swan, is a kind of Hitler-like figure. In fact, we see the chorus saying Hail Lohengrin and enacting a kind of halfway Hitler salute. And what this version of Lohengrin is essentially arguing is that someone like Lohengrin, who protects the woman and who embraces the role of being the emissary of the divine, who is charismatic enough to secure the admiration of the people, would be ideologically suspicious. In other words, that we have here the same thing that happened in the 1930s, that people think that they have found a savior figure who they then imbue with a kind of populist reactionary passion, which goes against all the rights of the state, etc. That is what this version had. And yet, if you look at Lohengrin itself, nothing could be less true. Within the opera Lohengrin, we don't have what is today the contemporary divide between populism and liberalism. Instead, the choice within Lohengrin, true to Wagner's political and philosophical artistic project, is the choice between paganism on the one hand and early Christianity. And so on the one hand, we have the pagan accuser who says, I raise my sword and we will find out in combat who is the true, let's say, emissary of God. Whoever wins will speak truth through combat. Combat being how the gods choose who will be victorious. Versus Lohengrin's appearance, which is the figure of early Christianity, the redeemer who doesn't raise the sword, who turns the other cheek, etc. And what's funny about Lohengrin is that we have two famous musical sequences. One is a marriage, and the second one is a marriage procession, right? We have two different marriage themes. And of course, within Lohengrin, and a good way, I think, to interpret it is that we have here two marriages, one of them interrupted, but I won't spoil it here. We have here the pagan and the early Christian, a mirroring that happens within Lohengrin itself. Now, of course, the marriage, the institution of marriage is precisely the liminal gap between the pagan world and the early Christian world. After all, the ritual of marriage, as it's depicted, for example, in Shakespeare, in, As You Like It? Is that it? As You Like It? Am I right? I think it's an As You Like It.
Yeah, and actually I was going to say A Midsummer Night's Dream is also the famous one. And that's the other famous musical wedding procession composed by Mendelssohn. So that's where we get all the wedding music from.
Right? That's where we get to have the pagan ceremonies, is within the wedding. But then also the emergence of the wedding as the holy union and the ultimate performative marker of bourgeois unity as we see it in Parsifal. And what's so interesting is that in Parsifal, one of the characters, we have two women. Again, there's a mirroring that goes on. We have the pagan wife and then we have the early Christian wife. One of them who's married to the accuser, the other one who is married to, or to be married to Lohengrin. And the pagan wife says to, what's her name? Elsa. Says to Elsa, how can you marry Lohengrin if you don't know his name? He came out of the sky. You know nothing about this person. Why do you think he would make a good husband if you've never actually met? And here we have a precursor of this sort of more contemporary liberal attitude towards love, which is to say, if you haven't gone online and made sure that your musical interests are the same, that your political interests are the same.
Sports teams are the same.
Exactly. If you haven't predetermined that you are a good fit, then you probably shouldn't get married because you will retroactively find out that it wasn't meant to be. Here we have, in a sense, the hysterical relationship of the student apropos the exam to the professor, saying, what do I need to know exactly so that I can perform accordingly in this exam, so that I can become the person who has a good outcome, a good formal mark? How can I perform, or how can I practice for the exam, essentially? So the pagan woman goes towards the early Christian woman, Elsa, who's going to be married to Lohengrin, and says, how can you marry this man whose name you don't know? Now, of course, I want to have a brief subnote here, which is that there's another pagan element, which Wagner takes also from Greek legend, which is that to know someone's name is to have power over them. And so Lohengrin's name cannot be mentioned, and if you know Lohengrin's name, you will have power over him, etc. What's important here is that we have, again, the Lacanian answer of the real. To know Lohengrin's name is to know who Lohengrin is, which means to have knowledge of Lohengrin, but not faith. And so we're back at the logic, which is early Christian, which is to say, it's not that you know God, it's that you believe in God. And that if you knew God, God wouldn't be God. But because you believe in God, you have faith, which is more important than the knowledge of God. Now, to bring it back to the concitative versus the performative, in a sense, if you knew what to do for the exam, it wouldn't be an exam.
It's precisely because you engage with the exam, which is supposed to be the ultimate marker of reason, right? The test of your reason. You have to believe in the exam. You have to believe that you can be the person who performs well in the exam so that you uphold the symbolic of the exam, which is remunerated in the symbolic master signifier of the grade. And so we see something similar happening in the logic of early Christianity, which is here tied to the logic of early bourgeois society, which is to say, I don't know who Lohengrin is, but I have faith that he will be mine. In other words, the knowledge that I have rests not on knowing in advance who he is, but having faith that I will come to know it. And this is where Žižek comes in again, because Žižek has always argued, based on Lacan, that there is no binary between knowledge and faith, that all knowledge rests on a kind of presupposed faith. Now, this isn't a theological argument. On the one hand, you could say it's also in the sense that we only have empirical knowledge based on abstract formulae, which is something that Hegel already wrote about, right? On a certain level, you have to start with pure abstraction in order to have a mathematical equation that leads to hard facts that are supposed to prove the immutable realities of material existence. Here we already have, again, the Hegelian unity of opposites, how the abstract becomes concrete and vice versa in a dialectical mediation. The same is true for Lacan when it comes to knowledge and faith. All knowledge and all participation in knowing action rests on a presupposition of believing in the worth of that action in the first place. In other words, you cannot participate successfully in the exam unless you believe that the exam matters. And you cannot participate in bureaucracy meaningfully unless you believe, rightfully so of course, that that bureaucracy retroactively has the power to determine your agency and position in the world, the difference between being a free citizen and an unfree citizen. And so your rational participation in the world, your knowledge of the world, is presupposed upon a minimal element of faith that there is indeed a formal exchange between your constitutive participation and then the ratification retroactively on the level of the performative, or for Lacan, the Master Signifier. This is so far so good? Okay, we're talking about Lohengrin still here. What's important here is that as soon as we saw in the ROH version, the Royal Opera House version of Lohengrin, as soon as you say that believing in Lohengrin is the beginning of a kind of reactionary fanaticism that will lead you to a populist frenzy that could lead you to World War III, as soon as you make this binary between the cult-like behavior of faith versus the hard, reasoned, empirical knowledge of justice, both of them break down, and suddenly you end up with the false accuser. You end up with the person who had falsely accused Elsa of murder in the first place. And that is precisely how, and this is something that Adorno wrote about, the Enlightenment proves itself as myth. Because the Enlightenment presupposes that there is empirical knowledge that doesn't rely on a certain minimal element of belief, of faithful participation in the world in which that knowledge can be rationalized, formalized, and become part of the symbolic. In the same way, to go back, in the traditional pre-modern world, the king ensured through his totally, in a sense, abstract and irrational position, right? The inherited position of a privileged person who's supposed to be the emissary of God, ensured the participation of the symbolic order through giving out royal grants to participate in society. We see this in London as well. Like, you can be the official royally designated purveyor of paint, and this means that your paint will be valued more than other versions of paint to paint your house, etc. What I'm trying to point out here is that for Žižek, there's a difference between knowledge and faith. Rather than seeing knowledge and faith as being a binary, in other words, that knowledge is the elimination of faith, and faith is the elimination of knowledge, which is how most atheists would present it to you, that knowledge is, in a sense, its own form of faith. Knowledge is its own form of faith in relation to the answer of the real, to the performative symbolic other. It relies on the filling in of a master signifier. I'm going to give you an example of that through something that relates to a joke we talked about before. The knowledge of the other is how Žižek refers to this faith. And the knowledge of the other we already had in the Sartre joke. Remember in the previous class, we talked, it's not even really a joke, but Sartre talked about psychosis. Sartre talks about a woman who goes to the doctor and says, I keep getting phone calls from God. And the doctor says, you can't get phone calls from God because God doesn't exist. And the woman says, thank you, but that's what I keep telling him. Now, there's another psychoanalytic take on this joke that Lacan formulated. And I think it's Lacan. I mean, it's circulated so much, I'm not sure, but I think it is. And it's about a man who believes that he is a grain of corn. He believes himself to be a grain of corn. And he goes to the doctor, and he said, the doctor finally convinces the man that he is not indeed a grain of corn. He is a human being. The patient goes outside, returns trembling back at the doctor, and the doctor says, what happened? And the man said, there was a chicken on the road. And the doctor says, yes, but don't you know, you are not a grain of corn. You are a man. And the man says, I know, but does the chicken know? The knowledge of the other is the realm of faith. This is the dialectic of presence and absence. This is Homer saying, God, if you don't want me to have this donut, I will eat it. My knowledge isn't predicated on your sending me a message. My knowledge is predicated on the absence of your message. And here we have again the realm of freedom, the realm of empirical rational action being presupposed by a liminal element of faith, which relies precisely on the message not being received. How do I know that the other doesn't know? And so for Žižek and Lacan, we're stuck in the knowledge of the other. Even if we know that we are free subjects, does the other know that we are free subjects? Even if I know when I go through customs that I am not a criminal, does the bureaucrat know that I am not a criminal? Even if I go into an exam being perfectly prepared, does the professor know that I am perfectly prepared? Even as an athlete, if I go into the champions finale, does the other team know that I am the champion? And so we are stuck in the gaze, the performative aspect of the other. And it is only in the knowledge of the other that our truth is retroactively formalized. And that is the trap that we are caught in, which Lacan calls the real, between the imaginary and the symbolic, between the constitutive and the performative. And the real contains the truth, which isn't a truth that undermines it, that we can see through. It's the truth that actually upholds them. And that's the dizzying part of it. Knowledge and faith, constitutive, performative, imaginary versus symbolic. Now, I want to end on one little note here, which is that we can find something very similar in Marx's theory of the commodity fetish. For those of you who have followed these classes for a long time, and perhaps read one of the previous books, you will know that in the beginning of the section on the commodity fetish, and thus Kapital, Marx quite clearly says that it doesn't matter that you can see through the commodity fetish. Just because you know that the fetish is a fetish doesn't make it not true. That in a sense, your rational knowledge that the commodity functions like a fetish doesn't exempt you from succumbing to the commodity fetish, since that structures your participation in the world. And so essentially we create this scenario, which Žižek has joked about, which is that you could have a class on the commodity fetish in which a student learns everything about the commodity fetish and then comes back to the professor and says, Professor, you taught me that the commodity fetish doesn't exist, but nobody else knows it. And here again we have the psychoanalytic joke. The man going back to the doctor saying, I know I'm not a grain of corn, but does the chicken know it? Here we have the woman going back to the doctor in the Sartrean tale saying, Doctor, I know God doesn't exist, but does he know that he doesn't exist? And so the knowledge of the other has to be reenacted with the other in order for us to participate in the symbolic order, which means that we are stuck. Our knowing that the symbolic is merely symbolic doesn't render it less true. In the same way that the trophy that you get at the end of a competition doesn't, by means of its emptiness, render the competition less true. In the same way that as the professor tells you your grade means nothing, and it's precisely because it means nothing that it means everything. In the same way that in the dialectic of presence and absence, it's because God is not there that he is everywhere. And that's how you make the link from the theological argument to the psychoanalytic argument, finally, to Žižek's theory of ideology. Ideology isn't the grip, the puppet-like control of a master figure who is exerting brainwashing control over you. The uncanny realization is that ideology works precisely because there is no overarching master figure. And it is within that emptiness that the Master Signifier has to emerge as a stand-in to allow for the subjective freedom of our own agency to unfold. And that if we were to eliminate that empty space, prove that it is indeed empty, the support for our own ideological participation in the world would collapse. We would succumb to a kind of complete nihilism of the abyss. And so as long as we remain hysterical subjects who say, why am I acting as if there were a big other, even though the big other doesn't exist? As long as we are the participants in an eternal exam in which we wish that we would be told how to live, we can live. And thereby, in a Hegelian fashion, our very failure becomes the presupposition for our success. On that note, thank you for joining us for this Monday morning lecture. I hope some of that made sense. We had some Lohengrin, we had some exams, we had jokes about lists, we had jokes about chickens, a little bit of everything.
Catholics.
Jokes about Catholics. That's a lot, but I hope that you enjoyed it.
Yes.
I hope it made some sense. Hello back to Serbia for someone.
Yes. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining us. And any final plugs or anything for the Discord?
Oh yes, we're gonna be hopping over to Discord. We're gonna be hosting Q&A discussion, talking about movies. Someone asked about Everything Everywhere All at Once, IRS. Yeah, that's all in the class. So maybe we'll talk about that.
And if you'd like to download my ebook that accompanies these lectures called 5 Keys to Žižek, you can find that exclusively on Patreon.
Link in bio.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a link in bio or in the About page. It's an ebook. It's less than 100 pages called 5 Keys to Žižek, where nothing is lacking. And if you can't always follow these classes, which I totally get, you can find a very condensed version. 5 Keys to Žižek is the ebook. It's available exclusively on Patreon. And through our patrons, we can keep these classes free for everybody else, which is insane. It's so cool.
We love that.
It makes us very, very happy.
Yeah, so good luck on all of your exams tomorrow or the day after. And we'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week.
Have a great week, everyone.
Bye, guys.